А вы вообще будете выступать не первым же?
Нет, я третий.
Третьим, окей, хорошо.
Good evening.
Добрый вечер.
Welcome here.
И добро пожаловать.
Я понимаю.
Society Corporation from Vienna. We have a lot of guests today. It's very nice. We have a lot of guests on this side. It's also great. And for us, it's a quite important evening because it's really on important issue that protection of climate and protection of environment is especially a difficult issue during war times, during dictatorship, and we try to proceed to see it, to elaborate the issues, to find the data, and yes, to report on it. Our experts here have done it and published this day three common reports. As you see, it is already one of our cases of society cooperation together with GreenThinkTank team and with CEDAR team, and only in this constellation we could do it, because we need a lot of people. Some of them are here, some of them are in exile, but some of them are also in the country, in Russia, and cannot be named. And this is our everyday situation which we are dealing with. The Dialogbüro, as many of you may not know, is working in democracy. Of course, it's now democratization, or the try of democratization. We are really fighting dictatorship, not only in Russia, but also in Belarus. And of course, we are doing it in a multilateral framework, working, of course, also in favor of Ukraine, working where we can with Georgia, with Armenia, and Moldova and other countries of the region. We have some, as we name it, green core aims. It's of course on sustainability, but also on anti-discrimination, and this leads us to the very actual issue of decolonisation. And as we all know, the questions of raw materials, of extractivism, which we see every day, so this was very close, connected with questions of the rights of the minorities, rights of the regions, and at least real federalization, which we do not have now. And I invite you to this evening under the chapter Middle East, Russian fossil fuels, climate, and European sanctions blind spots. We also know that the many sanctions which were also adopted already from 2022 and further, we have now also 21 packages, if I remember correctly. This means there are really thousands of measures, maybe hundreds. However, also the Russian regime adopted and find new ways for distribution, and so we speak about today. The moderation is today in the hands of Anna Samitz, who is a journalist and also a democracy expert, and the founder and director of the Impact Lens Foundation. Special welcome to you, and now it's Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Once again, my name is Anna Samitz. It's my pleasure to moderate today's event. I'm originally from Poland. I'm director of the Impact Lens Foundation. And we can assume that it's been 4 years right now since Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And we tend to believe that actually throughout all this time, Europe finally could find a way to cut its connection to Russian fossil fuels. But what if it's not quite true? What if, despite actually 20 packages of sanctions, there are still some blind spots through which Russian oil is flowing to Europe, actually along with gas? And we're going to explore these blind spots today and also answer the question not only what Russia is doing, but also what Europe is not seeing. And I have 4 excellent researchers with us today who will help us find all the answers to the questions that we should be asking today. So I will start from my left, from the lady, just for introductions. Olga Pindyuk, economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Then we have actually another lady, Rafaela, who will be translating today for Anton Lementuev, who is co-founder of GreenThinkTank.life, a researcher focusing on Russian extractive industries, energy and environmental risks, who is actually also from Kuzbas region of southwest Siberia, which is one of the regions known in the world for the largest extraction of coal. Then to my right, we have Artem Kochnev.
Correct.
Kochnev or Kochnev?
Kochnev.
Kochnev. Artem Kochnev, a climate and energy economist, Denkfabrik initiative. And last but not least, we have Arnold Khachaturov, who is director of CEDAR and head of data team at Novaya, Gazeta, Europe. And actually from Arnold, we're going to start the discussion. As we mentioned, actually 20 packages of sanctions we've already seen. And we may assume that Russian oil is more or less gone from Europe thanks to so many packages of sanctions. But your research actually tells quite a different story. Can you walk us through what you found on how Russian oil still managed to reach Europeans through reselling, and why sanctions did not manage to fully close that door?
Thank you very much for introduction, and thank you all for coming here. So yeah, I will tell you briefly about our report on how Russian oil gets to Europe after the war, where in this report we explore the geography of Russian oil and gas export and how it changed dramatically after 2022, and what effect sanctions have on the routes of Russian oil, how it enters global markets. So yeah, the first thing I want to tell you is the general overview. Probably you know that Russia played a major role in European energy market overall. Russia supplied, before the full-scale war in 22, about half of European gas and about 25% of crude oil. Then a dramatical shift happened, and by 2025 the shares dropped to 11% for gas, so 5 times less, and 3% for oil, which is about 8 times less. So it really changed, like, where Russia sells its oil. You can see here in this section what is still being officially imported by the EU. So the European countries continue to buy some Russian oil. There are some countries that are exempt from sanctions. Some Russian gas in the form of LNG, liquefied natural gas, also enters European markets, and just a small amount of coal still also does. And the EU has official plans to eliminate all Russian fossil fuels by 2030. This is a chart showing how it happened. So you can see a really sharp decrease. The orange line there, it's the EU as used to be the main importer of Russian oil and gas. And you can see also on the chart that the countries that replaced the EU were China and India, 2 biggest now markets for Russian oil and gas export, which take about 80% of all Russian mostly oil and gas, but that's most of the Russian fossil fuel exports. And India is the one who grew the most, from only 2%, which is almost nothing, to 40% of the share of Russian crude in its imports. So it's also became the main beneficiary of lower prices, because the sanctions, the situation on the market, it decreased the price of Russian export oil, and India was eager to use this advantage. And China, which almost doubled the share of Russian crude also in its imports, although China didn't get so many advantages in terms of prices as India. Yeah. So what was the reaction of the EU? EU introduced the full maritime crude oil embargo in December 22. It also limited the pipeline called Druzhba that flows for only for vulnerable member states that really depend on Russian energy infrastructure. It also introduced a price cap for G7 countries, which is now which should be reviewed every 6 months, I guess. Then another important event happened in 2025. In September and October, in autumn 2025, the US introduced powerful sanctions on 4 or 5 big Russian oil and gas producers. Oil that for some time at least disturbed significantly the flow of the availability of Russian companies to export its product. However, right now we have some mixed tendencies because of the war in the Gulf. Some sanctions were not temporarily lifted, but some U.S. sanctions were the U.S. government gave temporary licenses for other countries to be able to buy Russian oil for some limited period of time, just to keep the oil prices under a certain level. So, coming to the main topic, how the Russian oil still gets to Europe, apart from the small amounts that are still officially sold. So, first way is origin masking. The oil producers can use various techniques like refining, blending, and document laundering. All this to hide the origin of the oil, to make it look like it's maybe Indian oil or an oil from the Middle East, for example. The other one is using the big West infrastructure of shadow tankers, which travel without a flag or with other flags of different states that also hide the origin of the oil. Financial ecosystems, creating a parallel financial infrastructure that is not transparent for the US or EU monitoring agencies, like selling the oil for Chinese yuan or for Indian currencies or for rubles. Also, it's a re-entry as other products. For example, Russian crude can be sold as Turkish diesel or as Indian jet fuel, for example. And some sanctions blind spots that exist until 2025 at least. So now a few words about the main hubs of this oil laundering. One of them is Turkey, because Turkey significantly increased the exports of oil to EU countries. The consumption rose only 8%, but the exports rose like 56%, which means that most of this is transit flows of oil, which is presumably is bought from Russia and then remade and resell is as Turkish product, Turkish petrol, for example. Yeah, so here we see that Turkey started to import more oil and at the same time started to sell much more oil to the EU, which means probably that it's kind of a form of oil laundering. Here you can see just a chart showing the main refinery, the ports from which the exports happens. The other important gateway is India. India also grew its exports towards the EU countries. It's now EU's largest supplier. Some of Indian refineries, key refineries, they import large volumes of Russian crude, and we know it. And they even have been sanctioned for that by the US at some point. Some estimates show that about half of all the Indian exports to the EU was based on Russian refined oil. Yeah. The smaller one is Georgia. It's also a micro hub that also exports oil and oil products, which increased fourfold, but it's still smaller amounts than India and Turkey. And the same pattern we see here, sharp increase in export, that exceeding domestic needs. That means that this form of export is a formal origin change. So yeah, to do that, as I mentioned, Russia uses the parallel financial infrastructure by passing the dollar system, using yuan, rupee, dirham, and so on, using Russian China oil trade, substitute for the SWIFT, using alternative insurance and compliance companies, and using, of course, the famous shadow fleet. Yeah. Yeah, so, and these flows, these shadow flows that I'm talking about, they are not visible through official import data because, as I mentioned, they are clean, they're laundered, and they are reflected as some other country's oil. So we cannot directly spot it and count it. So the EU reacted on this. So this is a problem that the EU officials are very well aware of. And from the 18th sanction package, they started to implement some barriers that would prevent Russian oil in refined form to travel to European countries. And actually it worked, at least for now. The recent data that we had shows that in the first quarter of 2026, the number of oil, of this shadow oil that traveled to EU being refined before that, decreased 2 times. And what was the sanction? What was the solution? So they introduced a new rule where importers must provide origin of crude used in the refined products. So you cannot anymore buy any kind of product without showing its origin. You have to guarantee that you didn't use Russian crude, and this is pretty straightforward. I think it was able to decrease the amount of Russian oil going to EU. And yeah, just to conclude, like the overall impacts of these sanctions and this struggle to ban Russian oil. What they did, the Western sanctions, mostly they raised the logistical costs, the cost of sending the oil to the market, because you have to pay more now for the transportation, for the insurance, and compliance. And so the buyers, they require significant discounts, so they buy Russian oil much cheaper than some Western buyers would do before the war. You can see some more figures here with the exact examples of this discount. However, it's important to note that those discounts, they do not last for long term usually. For example, when there were these big sanctions against 4 Russian leading oil producers in the autumn 2025, for some time, maybe for a month or maybe a few months, it disrupted the logistics of Russian exports, but then after those months, the discount stabilized. So discount is really growing until the producers find it just a new way, new routes, new buyers for the oil. This one I will skip, maybe talk about it later. This also. Yeah, so just to conclude, for the moment, Russian oil sector has proven resilient to the sanctions. So they were able to find new markets. which are less lucrative. They earn less money. They sell oil with a discount, but still this discount is not such a big problem for the budget. It didn't cut off the Russian oil revenues, oil and gas revenues. However, we cannot say that sanctions are not working. They're working, but in a very maybe slow manner, and they are not maybe built to end the war and to cut the oil and gas revenues at once, but they have like a slow effect. And the EU is refining loophole sanctions, like the recent example that I talked about in 2026, asking for origin certificate for the oil coming from Turkey, for example. No single measure broke Russia's export capacity, but each layer, each new sanction, it raises costs and narrows routes and compounds it over time. And so just I think yesterday there was this new sanction package that was discussed, not yet adopted, which shows the EU strategy, current strategy for banning Russian oil from the market. It consists in fighting the infrastructure, in banning more and more shadow tankers as possible, adding new shadow tankers to the list, to the sanctioned list, and trying to block the infrastructure of the financial infrastructure, the insurance infrastructure of Russian exports. It's a slow, so it's not revolutionary. The package. The EU has a very, I think, comprehensive and quite slow but coherent approach, while the US has much more powerful tools like the SDN list, the sanction, being able to sanction the concrete companies, which it can use from time to time, like they did it in last autumn, and it was much more powerful for the damage was bigger than from the EU sanctions. But however, they tend to change. It's not consistent. They can change their minds. Tomorrow, Trump will meet with Putin and maybe will cancel the sanctions and so on. So we have like two different approaches. Maybe together they will eventually lead to Russia's share on the European market going close to zero.
Thank you so much, Arnold, for this very comprehensive presentation, which is based on your research. By the way, there were postcards at the entrance. Maybe you have seen them, and one of them, Shadow Routes, How Moscow Learned to Reroute Its Exports, actually contains a QR code where you can find this analytical report and read much more. And by the way, I would also like to greet our audience online. So for the audience online, I hope our organizers could also actually provide a link for the report to be easily found. And we're going to go back to you on the second half of the question about the current situation and how the war in Iran and the closure of Strait of Hormuz is affecting the situation. But for the sake of time, we'll move to other speakers, and in the second round, we're going to address that as well. So the next speaker is Artem. And Artem, here we're going to actually bring the Austrian angle of the debate as well. So let's have a closer look into the domestic situation as well, because it's not only about the oil and gas we are actually still buying, but some Austrian companies are still doing business in Russia. How is that so? I mean, they're still operating there, paying taxes to the budget, which ultimately is used to finance the war in Ukraine. So my question is, how is this possible? And could you touch upon especially the story of the Raiffeisen Bank, which has made absolutely enormous profit operating in Russia since 2022? And what actually keeps the Raiffeisen Bank in Russia? Is it their own will to stay there because of the profit? Is it actually the situation that they cannot leave because Moscow also doesn't let them leave? Or is it because it's quite convenient, they also through them, actually, the money through the Turk stream, like revenues through the Turk stream, which is still used to bring gas to some of the European countries. They are central to these operations as well. So the floor is yours. Sorry about the complicated question.
No.
And you also have a presentation,
Yes,
right?
yes, thanks. Oh, voilà. I've locked the laptop. If somebody can unlock it for me, that would be really, really helpful.
Do we have the password?
Yeah.
Nice work.
Well, I guess in the meantime,
Can you press Ctrl-Alt-Delete?
to unlock,
Yeah.
let's see if it works.
Oh.
Well, I guess we need
We still need a password.
we need a hacker in the room. So
I'm coming. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm coming. Speak about something.
So, if it's going to take a little bit more time, we can actually go back to. Would you like to start without the presentation, or we can go back to Arnold?
well, I think you can go with a couple of questions with Arnold in the
So
meantime.
we will go back to Arnold's small technical break for Artem's presentation. So the question we didn't ask, but we were supposed to go back to. So the Strait of Hormuz, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, how is actually affecting Russian revenues? Because from the first glance, it seems like Russia is gaining because the oil prices are surging. But I know the situation is a little bit more complicated. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure, I can. Although I have had some figures in the presentation which I don't remember, but I remember the conclusion. So, yeah, when the war happened in Iran, the oil prices, as you know, they surged, they increased significantly, and so this was perceived as something very good for the Russian budget and budget revenues, and it was the case. Russian oil revenues, they increased in those months, I think in March and in April. But at the same time, there are some other factors that lead to the situation that right now the Russian budget is maybe at its lowest, poorest position since the beginning of maybe not 22, but for a few years now. Why is that? Because one thing is that when oil prices go up, usually Russian currency, the ruble, also tends to be more stable and more powerful. And so for each dollar you get less rubles. And so the Russian budget gets less rubles for the same amount of oil that it exports. This is one thing. So with a strong currency, it's hard to have the same level of revenues. Another factor is that Russia compensates its internal. The tax system is built in a way to compensate for high prices on the world market, so that to keep the internal prices of petrol, for example, at a certain level. So they give payouts to the companies so they do not export petrol for high prices abroad and keep the petrol inside the country. And so these payments, they also go from the budget. And when you have high export prices, you have to pay more for the companies so they could keep the petrol for their internal customer, which also tends to decrease the revenues. And another factor is the Ukrainian quite successful tax on the Russian oil refinery system. According to our estimates, about a third of Russian refineries, in terms of production, of petrol production, they were hit and damaged by the strikes, drone strikes mostly. And this also led to a decrease in oil production, and the companies having financial troubles and so on. And so, yeah, for this year, the situation is that the budget deficit is supposed to be maybe 50% or even 2 times higher than it was expected, and it's really getting hard for the economy to go on with such inflated military spending.
Thank you for drawing this complex picture for us, but now we're actually moving to the domestic situation and the Austrian companies that we interrupted the presentation, but now it's back on the screen. So Artem, please, what is the situation with Austrian companies operating in Russia, and how come actually the sanctions do not address this?
Well, I will start with the sanctions because there is a lot of talk about this. Also domestically, when it was 2022, in Russia, there was a very big perception that the sanctions will obliterate the Russian economy, and there were very strong statements which continue even to this day. So the recent package has been announced, And if you go to the Facebook page of the European Commission, what you see there is they say, our sanctions keep biting hard and they're cutting deep. Now, this is a very strong statement. The European Union wants to show that it has the muscle. The problem is when you start to make a reality check. And the reality check from a few years back, actually, from 2023, is that Russia did most of oil drilling in a decade, even as sanctions hit. Now, the obvious question is what's going on? Why, despite all of those efforts, and why, despite of all of those claims, and why, despite of the very heavy target of sanctions on the oil industry in Russia, seemingly nothing happens, or at least we don't see as big of an effect, we don't see a collapse of the Russian economy as it was originally predicted. And to understand what's going on, I suggest you to go a little bit on the very micro level. I will give you a story of the company, which is called Nomatek, which is located in Russia, in Western Siberia, close to the Arctic, in the city of Noyabrsk. What this company is doing, it's producing high-tech oil equipment and metals, which is needed for the drilling of oil. It is part of the Austrian company, which is called SBO, previously known as Scholler-Bleckmann. It's doing pretty much the same business. It's producing high-tech equipment for oil and gas companies such that they can drill and get the oil out. It's not a big company in terms of its size. If you look at the numbers, the revenue size is about 10 million euros. It's not terribly big. It's very sizable for Russian standards, but for the Europe, it's not a big one. And the local production that it has a very sizable team of 100 persons. They stay in Russia, they produce their own equipment there. Now, why is that important? Because Nomatek is part of the companies which enable the oil industry in Russia to extract oil and continue extracting the oil and increase the capacity of production. How do we know that? Well, partly we know that this company is active from the legal charges that they make. You know, you can have a company which is still in Russia, but it does nothing but sales, and sales can be stopped relatively quickly. This is not one of them. This company is actually giving leasing contracts to service companies in Russia, which then do the drilling with this equipment. And this equipment then allows to expand the production capacities. You can actually go through the list of the legal charges that they make, and you see that they have a very active business with the companies which are one of the major industry leaders at this point. So one of them is called Technobor. It's the leading enterprise for doing the drilling. And they're doing the drilling for whom? They're doing it for the companies which are the major oil producers, which are the major oil extractors, which is Rosneft, which is Gazprom, which is Lukoil. So what this industry is effectively doing is they're enabling the production of oil within the country. Now, how does it factor into the overall sanctions framework, right? Because we would expect that the exports of a lot of tech and equipment is not possible from Europe to Russia any longer. The issue is that this company has a localized production, and they have a team which does the assembling locally, so they don't have to import from Europe or from the European Union as much as they would need otherwise, because everything that they do is local. Now, why this particular company is important? Not all of the oil service companies are made the same. There are companies which are just doing something that you can relatively easily substitute. So whenever the company exits, you can just find a Chinese producer. Now, Nomatek is not this company. Nomatek is part of the high-tech industry, which is very hard to substitute. What they're doing is pretty much three things. They produce specific metals, which is a very complicated alloy of different metals, which have specific properties. These properties allow you to drill inside of the earth without having any disturbance from the magnetic field. And this is necessary because when you drill these days, you don't drill the pipes like the old ways. So usually, as I would expect, when you do the drilling, you want to get to the oil path somewhere up here, and you do the drilling vertically. This is what most of us probably know from the movies and things, right? This is not the way how it's done these days. what happens frequently is that, well, we have the curvature in the Earth. And the oil shale, where the oil is located, it's not distributed evenly. It's not just a big reservoir. It's actually, there's a small slide up there. And when you do the drilling, you just get only a bit of it. So what the oil industry has figured out over the years is that we don't want to have a vertical well. We actually want to move sideways to reach these different pockets of oil which are out there in the sides. For that, you need the so-called horizontal drilling. The horizontal drilling is when you do the pipe horizontally, pretty obvious, not the vertically, horizontally, or under the angle. This is called directional drilling. Now, for this directional drilling, you need sophisticated equipment which would identify down there, many kilometers down in the Earth, where are you located, and what is the most probable location of a reservoir. For that, you need to throw some protons, atoms, and do the measurements inside of there. And the company Nomatec is doing the equipment which allows you the steering of the pipe to go in the proper direction and do the evaluation of the placement and the most probable location of the shale reservoir out there. If you don't have it, you cannot drill horizontally. So what this does, it becomes the part of what we call enabling industries. It's a choke point. It means that if you remove it out from the process is done no matter how much money you pour in, meaning you are irreplaceable. That's why Nomatec is critical, together with a few other companies which are still located on the Russian market, and they're doing the service there. The question is, how big is this market and how big is the contribution of Nomatec specifically? We can estimate that. So if you look at the forecast of the oil production, just the oil, I leave out a gas, what we see is that according to the latest forecast, which was published, I think, last year, there is a steady expectation of a steady production in Russia. So it's slightly below 10 million of barrels per day. The issue is that a lot of that, what we see these days from this 10 million, it's the brownfield oil wells. It means they have been already drilled, and they are old ones. That means they are not as deep and they don't have as much capacity as they used to have in the beginning. The highest capacity it has is in the first year. And so this brownfield investment, or the brownfield exploration, that's actually going down steadily, about 5 to 10% per year. To keep the level at 10 million barrels per day, where it is right now, you have to create new fields. You have to drill new wells. So there's a greenfield and exploration things. And for these things, considering relatively harsh conditions in which Russian exploration industry, climate-wise, is standing, because a lot of these reservoirs are in Arctic or Western or Eastern Siberia, which is traditionally very hard to get. It's a swampy area. It's a cold area. You need sophisticated equipment. You need this horizontal drilling. And for this amount, which is red on this picture, you actually need the Western technology. Russia is not able to produce it. In fact, it's not enough to have even Chinese technology, because China is not operating in the same climate areas. So all of this red area that you see up to the horizon of 2050, this is what the Western companies are enabling by still working there. Now, how big is the contribution of Nomatec? We don't know exactly. We can just approximate it. Nomatec is responsible for about 1.5% of the oil service market for this specific high-tech equipment. If you calculate the amounts, you can integrate or you can just sum up in Excel. What you will find out is that if you just multiply this 1.5% with the amount of greenfield and exploration oil which could be, or at least which Russia predicts to extract, what you would see is that it potentially unlocks the production of 11 million barrels in just 2026 alone. If you sum up to 2050, you get 700 million barrels. Now, the answer itself, like the volume alone doesn't tell you, right? What does it mean? We can convert it into the CO2 equivalent emissions. And if you convert it to this accounting unit, which is just how much of that is equivalent to a CO2 being spoiled into the air, in 2026, it's 4 million tons of CO2 equivalents alone. How much is that? Austria itself, over the year, produces about 70 million tons of CO2 equivalent. This is the amount that potentially Nomatec, if it stays until 2036, for the next 10 years, this is the amount that Nomatec will potentially unlock. So the 1 year of CO2, like you take everybody from Austria, 9 million people, and you throw it on the trip across the planet several times, on the plane, 9 million people. This is what the result would be, this is going to be equivalent to be. And then you can multiply it by about 4.5 times. This is the amount that Nomatec potentially unlocks to be poisoned out in the air, in the environment. And this is just a single company with a revenue of about 10 million euros. Now, this is the higher bound, obviously, because there is a possibility to substitute, or, for instance, if you can't do the horizontal drilling, right, as is today's standards, you can do multiple vertical drilling. So the impact would not be as terrible as I produced there. It's an upper bound. But this is effectively the potential contribution of a single Austrian company on the market. Now, the total market size is much bigger, right? So you can multiply it multiple times actually to get what the total impact of the foreign companies is. And there will be a more elaborate discussion on that. So we'll produce a report with the support of Dialogbüro, specifically to show you how much the impact is not just for Austria, but for many, many other companies which still stay on the Russian market. I'll stop there for the time being when it comes to the contribution of the Austrian company.
Yes,
do we have time for the Raiffeisen story?
Probably for the second round. We'll leave it because we need to move on. Just one very quick question. It's extremely interesting story, and I'm wondering, did you talk to Nomatec as well to get a statement on what's happening, or it was completely impossible?
No, I didn't. I didn't contact Nomatec specifically. I think it's more of a journalist work, in a way. But usually the companies of that type, they have a very standardized, very polished corporate statements. I looked, for instance, one of the statements by a company which is supplying paint, which is being used, for instance, for very highly corrosive environments. And usually what they say is they say, look, we're complying with the international sanctions regime. We are doing very good compliance job. This is the message. Which implicitly means, like, we stay within the rules as they are written.
Right.
Right? It doesn't mean that we stay with the spirit of the rules. We're just making the job, just nobody bothers us. I would expect something similar from Scholler Blackman, which is the company has been pressed over the years, and there have been multiple media inquiries on the same time. My general impression was that it was a little different from what has been done by the other companies.
Okay, thank you so much. We have to move on to the next speaker, which is Anton. Anton is going to speak in Russian. We're going to have translation from Rafaela. Anton, if actually somebody asks you about the concept of Putinism, which is another key issues that we wanted to touch upon today, actually your Cole research pretty much addresses this whole thing. It's the state captured by the industries that it's supposed to regulate, propping them up not because they make money, but because they serve Putin's power. So can you tell us a little bit more how it plays out in the coal sector, how it connects to the war economy, and finally, why it all matters for us here in Europe?
Okay, I'll start with the
presentation.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry, I don't speak very well in English, and I just start to speak in Russian. Rafaela helps me. Thank you. Начну с того, что я являюсь исследователем-редактором объединения GreenThinkTank. Мы выпускаем аналитические доклады о России, о том, какие изменения происходили в России с ключевыми отраслями в энергетике и с охраной природы.
I'm one of the co-founders and redactors at GreenThinkTank, and we are regularly publishing reports on what is going on nowadays in Russia in the extractive industry sector and regarding environmental and climate questions and the effect of these industries on the environment.
Да, вот. На входе лежат посткардс, вы можете их взять, прочитать наши доклады. Уверен, вам будет очень
As you
интересно.
walk out, you will find these postcards, and I assume it will be very interesting to you to read more about our work and our research.
Я являюсь автором доклада о российской угольной отрасли, и наш доклад показывает то, как российская угольная отрасль изменилась во время войны. Я являюсь специалистом по угольной отрасли, и я надеюсь, вам будет очень интересно узнать о ней.
In my research, I focus on the coal industry, on the coal mining and coal producing industry, and my research focuses on how this industry has changed since the beginning of the war against Ukraine, and I hope it will be interesting for you to listen to some of the aspects that I cover in my research.
Многие годы я боролся против угольных компаний в России, в моем родном Кузбассе. Кузбасс – это регион в Сибири, это очень далеко отсюда. Это главный угледобывающий регион в России.
For many years, I've been fighting against coal companies in Russia, especially in the region of Kuzbass, which is located in Siberia. It's very far away from here, and it's the main coal-producing region in Russia.
Многие годы российская угольная отрасль богатела и выживала благодаря экспорту в Евросоюз. После начала войны угольная отрасль потеряла европейский рынок и пришла в кризис.
For many years, the Russian coal sector became rich thanks to exports to Europe, thanks to regular exports to Europe, but revenues fell sharply after the beginning of the full-scale war against Ukraine because Russia lost the European market.
Сразу после начала войны Китай помог сохранить экспорт угля из России, но сегодня 70% угольных компаний в России находятся в убыточном состоянии, и это самый тяжелый кризис за последние 25 лет.
Immediately after the beginning of the war, China stepped in and helped Russia's coal industry to stay active and not to collapse. But nowadays, 70% of all Russian coal companies make losses, and it's the biggest crisis in the industry that Russia has ever faced.
Обо всем этом вы прочитаете в нашем докладе, но я бы хотел вам рассказать о другом. Я бы хотел вам рассказать, что такое путинизм глазами человека, живущего в Сибири и который много лет боролся с его последствиями.
If you take a closer look at my research, you can read more about what I've just been telling you, but tonight I would like to focus on some other question, which is the question of Putinism. I've been researching the phenomenon of Putinism for many years, and I've also been fighting against it in my work.
Сегодня, когда идет ужасная война против Украины, возможно, кажется не очень понятно, почему мы говорим о российской угольной отрасли, но я хочу вам рассказать о ней как о модели путинизма, как он возник на примере угольной отрасли и какие последствия, какие глобальные последствия путинизма есть сегодня.
Nowadays, facing a horrifying war which is going on against Ukraine, maybe it's not so clear why we are actually talking about the coal sector and touching upon these questions, but I would like to demonstrate Putinism and its consequences, focusing on the example of the coal sector and focusing on the consequences that it has for today's economy.
Я наблюдаю путинизм буквально с начала его зарождения и боролся против угольных компаний уже последние 15 лет я видел, как именно путинизм уничтожает окружающую среду в России, и я сейчас расскажу, что это такое.
I've been observing Putinism basically since it first appeared, and I've been fighting against it for 15 years. I just observing how Putinism is consequently destroying the environment, and this is what I would like to speak about tonight.
Он возможен лишь в одном случае, когда существует крайне низкая ценность человеческой жизни, когда энергоресурсы и прочие ископаемые добываются с максимальным ущербом для окружающей среды.
So the case we're observing here is linked to the fact that the life of a human being has an extremely low value, and that nature and the environment is exploited at an extremely low cost.
И очень важный момент, на примере того, что сейчас говорили коллеги, путинизм награждает тех, кто не сопротивляется, а идет по пути наименьшего сопротивления, зарабатывая деньги на торговле ископаемыми.
And one important aspect that we have already been touching upon tonight with our colleagues is the fact that Putinism corrupts those who walk the path of least resistance and who take part in this business of exploiting nature and the environment.
Мы долгие годы наблюдали, как в России с момента, как Путин пришел к власти, происходила деэкологизация, как уничтожались природоохранные организации, как разрушались системы защиты прав человека.
It's been many years since we've been observing how, since the surge of Putinism in Russia, a certain process of de-ecologization is going on, which means that the consequences for the environment have become worse and worse, how organizations who care for the environment are being destroyed, and also how human rights organizations are being destroyed and banned.
Первое, что сделал Путин, когда пришел к власти в области изменения экологического законодательства, он подчинил контролирующий орган, который должен контролировать промышленность, самой промышленности.
The first thing that Putin did as he came into power was changing Russian regulatory systems and Russian laws regarding environmental protection, and he subordinated and subjuncted the authority that was actually responsible for environmental protection.
Это одна из основ существования экстрактивизма, отсутствие контроля, низкий контроль и деэкологизация.
So the lack of control and the lack of monitoring of environmental questions is one of the basic factors of the extractivism, which is part of Putinism.
Вот на этом примере хорошо видно, как с момента прихода Путина к власти с 2000 года добыча угля в угольных разрезах открытым способом резко возрастает, и это стало возможным благодаря деэкологизации, подавлению гражданского общества, подавлению свободной прессы.
As we can see, since Putin came into power in 2000, 78% of Russian coal is produced in open pit mines, which is the cheapest way to produce coal. This all is happening, this all is made possible by suppressing and subjuncting civil society and human rights and the freedom of speech and press.
Несмотря на это, Европейский Союз всегда был наиболее прибыльным рынком для не только торговли газом и нефтью, но и торговли углем.
Still, the European Union had always been the most profitable market, not only for gas and oil, but also for coal.
Ну, по достаточно приблизительным подсчетам можно сказать, что Россия заработала на торговле энергоресурсами, на торговле с Евросоюзом порядка 2 триллионов евро за 20 лет, то есть до момента начала войны.
2 trillion euros were earned approximately just from fossil fuel sales to the EU.
Как я и говорил, путинизм базируется на максимальной эксплуатации окружающей среды и максимальном ее загрязнении. Согласно данным российской статистики, у нас происходят порывы нефтепроводов, pipelines, а каждые 30 минут один порыв.
As you can see here, one oil pipeline ruptures every 30 minutes, and Putinism is profiting from polluting the environment.
Важный момент – это вот эта часть, что 90% порывов, даже по российским данным, причина – это коррозия. То есть это максимально дешевая добыча.
The corrosion, as you can see here, makes up for 90%, and the profit lies in the low price of corrosion. So corrosion is the cheapest way possible.
Еще один интересный пример – это как путинизм переворачивает понятия и как путинизм борется с изменением климата, не делая для этого ничего.
Another interesting fact is how Putinism is distorting certain concepts and certain words, and they actually talking about protecting the environment, but actually they're not doing anything in this regard.
Вот это один из характерных примеров, когда государство стремится к снижению выброса парниковых газов. Россия поставила цель снизить уровень парниковых газов, выброса парниковых газов до уровня 1990 года. Ну, мало кто знает, что в 1990 году выбросов было значительно больше.
So Putin ordered greenhouse gas emissions to fall to the level of 1990, but actually hardly anyone knows. But in that year, greenhouse gas emissions were actually higher.
Кроме того, в 2025 году Путин поручил снизить выбросы парниковых газов, и российские ученые и чиновники придумали, как уменьшить выбросы парниковых газов за счет того, что просто по-другому посчитали эмиссию, и в том числе за счет поглощения сибирскими лесами парниковых газов.
So researchers and government officials just made up a new calculating system in order to reach this goal that Putin had ordered, meaning the goal of greenhouse gas emissions falling to 65 to 67% in 2025. They just shifted this whole process onto the absorption of forests in order to reach this goal.
Но мы посчитали, да, мы, используя спутниковые снимки и, собственно, методику подсчета, а также методику, используемую международными учеными, мы посчитали, что выбросы от лесных пожаров в одной только Якутии соответствуют выбросам крупных европейских стран. Из чего можно сделать вывод, что российские леса не поглощают, а, вероятно, наоборот, выбрасывают парниковые газы.
So one thing that researchers and government officials did was focusing on the absorption of forests, but also, I forgot to say that before, pardon, they changed the calculating system. So the whole monitoring and calculating system, regulation, the word was just changed. So actually you can say and tell by these data that forests are actually not absorbing emissions, but actually emitting them. And also only wildfires, as you can see on the third point, 237 to 280 million tons of CO2 And you can compare this on the emissions of countries of the size of Spain or Germany.
France, Spain, yeah. Вот то, что вы видите, это еще один интересное проявление лингвистики путинизма.
Another interesting phenomenon is the linguistics of Putinism.
Вот видите вот это название зоны контроля.
Can you see this name, control zone?
В реальности это территория, на которой ничего не контролируется и на которой пожары никто не тушит.
Actually, control zone means that this is a zone where nobody extinguishes wildfires and nobody extinguishes forest fires, so nothing is under control.
Кроме того, наша группа наблюдала за тем, как происходит эмиссия метана, и мы увидели одну очень тревожную вещь. Недавно вышло исследование... давайте перейду.
You can see on this picture the results of the work of our research team who observed methane emissions.
Недавно было опубликовано исследование Всемирного банка.
And the World Bank recently published a document.
В котором говорится, что Россия сейчас значительно нарастила сжигание газа на факельных установках при добыче нефти.
And in oil-producing plants, more and more gas is being burned in Russia.
Но мы увидели нечто более тревожное. Дело в том, что эти скважины в нормальной ситуации должны либо не выбрасывать газ, либо сжигать газ.
No, but what is worrying us even more is that gas should actually neither be deposited nor being burned.
Однако спутник дает увидеть, что у скважины есть фаза номер 3, это выбрасывание метана.
But here we can see, as we say, phase 3, which means methane emission is going on.
И эти выбросы никогда не попадают ни в одни отчетные документы в форму международной отчетности.
And these methane emissions never make it to any official document and never make it to any international monitoring document.
Проблема в том, что Россия по-прежнему участвует во многих международных процессах, связанных с борьбой с изменением климата.
But the thing is, Russia is still taking part in many international processes regarding mitigating climate change.
И Россия показывает те изменения, о которых я говорил раньше.
And Russia is demonstrating those changes that I touched upon earlier.
Изменения подсчетов парниковых газов.
So I mean the changes in calculating and monitoring rates of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions.
В реальности мы думаем, что даже цифра, существовавшая ранее, то есть до этого пересчета, была крайне сильно занижена.
But actually, we think that the number and the share of those emissions was even lower before these new methods of calculation and monitoring.
И используя современные методы и собственное понимание работы индустрии, можно это доказать.
And if we take a closer look at the industry and do some deeper research, we can actually prove that.
Да. Это небольшой такой словарь путинизма.
Here we have a little dictionary regarding Putinism.
Наиболее здесь, наверное, вам знакомое выражение special military operation.
You're probably all familiar with the term special military operation.
Это наиболее тяжелые последствия путинизма, и начало войны для нас было большим шоком, но, к сожалению, оно не было полностью неожиданно.
This is the most terrible consequence of the most terrible result of Putinism, and the beginning of the war was an immense shock for all of us, but unfortunately we all had to count on this happening.
Второй пример undesirable organization. Это звучит как undesirable, то есть нежелательные. На самом деле это запрещенные организации, с которыми нельзя сотрудничать, и за сотрудничество с которыми можно сесть в тюрьму на много лет.
Undesirable organizations, the word undesirable actually can be translated into forbidden, which means that these organizations are actually forbidden, and also working together with them is forbidden. So anyone who works with them or supports their work in anyhow can end up in jail.
Для меня очевидно, я это видел много лет, post-money land restoration. В реальности происходит обратный процесс, когда угольные шахты превращаются в открытые угольные разрезы.
Post-mining land restoration, this actually means that coal mines are being converted into open pit mines.
В зонах контроля, как говорил ранее, в целом это наиболее характерные примеры лингвистики путинизма с точки зрения человека, который занимается охраной окружающей среды.
And what I touched upon earlier is do you mean fire control zones? Excuse me? Yeah. This is actually the most prevalent and the most obvious example of the language of Putinism for a researcher who is mainly asking questions about environmental problems.
Okay. Так выглядит пример post-mining land restoration.
What is the post-mining land restoration? You can see in this picture.
Да,
this
то есть
is an example.
20 лет назад здесь была ровная поверхность.
20 years ago, there was an even landscape.
Сейчас это 360 метров в глубину.
And now here we can see a hole of a depth of 360 meters.
И это называется угольный разрез, и они расположены в городах в Кузбассе.
This is called an open coal mine, and it's located in the city or in the region of Kuzbas.
Это просто пример того, какие у этого последствия. То есть всего за 2 недели вот этот город, который вы видите здесь на картинке.
Can you see this city on the left, on your left? And now we will see an example for what happened just within 2 weeks.
2 недели. Вот то, что черное, это накопление пыли на снегу. То есть вот здесь везде живут люди.
So this is actually dust. Called black snow turned black, and these are all cities and places where residents actually live.
Сегодня в моем родном регионе в Кузбассе продолжительность жизни у мужчин 62 года.
And in my home region in Kuzbas, the life expectancy of an average man nowadays is 62 years.
И это прямое следствие 20 лет путинизма, при котором ценность человеческой жизни и, кстати, частной собственности ничего не стоит.
And this is a direct consequence of 20 years of Putinism, a concept on which, in which the life of a human being and actually also private property, things that belong to people, do not mean anything, have a very low value.
Так происходило все годы, пока Россия продавала уголь в Евросоюз, также происходит и сегодня.
And this all happened while Russia was selling coal to the European Union, and this keeps happening today.
It's example. Black snow. В завершении, до начала войны это был самый смешной пример, но сейчас он не смешной, но я его расскажу.
What I'm going to tell you now used to be a funny example in my field before the war, but now it is not funny at all anymore, actually.
В одном кузбасском городе из такого грязного снега построили вот такую горку для детей.
So in one of the cities in Kuzbas region, out of this kind of snow, they built a little hill for children to slide.
Но она была черная.
But it was black.
Местные власти покрасили белой краской эту черную горку.
And so the city council, basically the authorities, came and painted it white. So it looked like snow.
В этом суть путинизма. То есть вместо того, чтобы решать проблему, достаточно перевернуть понятие и покрасить черный снег белой
And this is a
краской.
characteristic of Putinism. So instead of really working on issues, they just turn things around and show things that are actually black as if they were white.
Сегодня российские ископаемые появляются в Евросоюзе лишь потому, что они не называются российскими.
And nowadays Russian commodities show up on the European market just because they don't wear the label Russia.
Ну и в завершении хочу сказать, призвать вас, потому что грязь останется в России, но воздействие на климат и трансграничные последствия аварий от деэкологизации в России имеют глобальные последствия.
Yeah, and I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the dirt is staying in Russia, but the global consequences of environmental damage caused by the Russian regime will soon be seen in the whole world on a global level.
That's all. Thank you for attention.
Anton, thank you so much. It was a very informative presentation, and I know there might be a lot of questions, and that's why I would like to send you to the report that you can find on the postcard. Again, there is a QR code, and right after the discussion, there will be a chance to talk to Anton. Also, keep your questions because we have one more speaker, and then I'm going to give the floor to the audience for potential questions. So, Olga Pindyuk, who is an economist, actually you look at all of this through the widest lens, geopolitics and security. And also from Kuzbas region, we'll go back to Brussels. And I think it's a perfect cycle, and perfect, by the way, ending of Anton's presentation as well. What actually Brussels can do better? Now, 21st package of sanctions has been discussed. We touched upon a little bit what it contains, but what are some of the things that can be still addressed at the European level to actually help, maybe not solve the problem altogether, but at least make it easier for us? So,
I think I would just like to start first to go a little bit back and try to remind ourselves in what situation did the EU find itself and the full-scale invasion of Russia and Ukraine started. And it's not to kind of find excuses for the EU, but also not to minimize the amount of work which has been done by the EU. So in 2022, at the beginning of 2022, the EU was still under very, believing in a very strong illusion that this concept of Wandel durch Handel, introduced by Germany, that it works, and that by creating these economic interdependencies, it means that you will also cooperate politically with countries. The hostilities probability is minimized in this context. But we all know that it was a bit of a naive thinking, and not least because these interdependencies, economic interdependencies, they were heavily skewed and very asymmetric. And this was just, plain game theory, that if you are really heavily dependent on someone, you are creating opportunities for this power, which that some autocratic regime has over you, to abuse it. And that's exactly what happened. I think one of the reasons why Russia was attacking Ukraine was the belief that the EU is so heavily dependent economically on the energy supplies that it cannot do much. Yeah, so keeping that in mind, I think we should actually acknowledge the progress which has been made. I would, of course, come to that it's not perfect, but if you look at just pure numbers, how much natural gas and oil accounted for in the EU imports prior to 2022, and it was already mentioned in your presentation that it has become much lower now, and it was not a simple trick to perform. It was possible, largely speaking, due to two things. First, the increasing role of the United States as a global energy producer and exporter. And second, which also shouldn't be underestimated, it's this push for green transition, the three-power EU in the European Union. And, this is something which is very difficult to pull off politically because there are so many different stakeholders which do not want to change the status quo. Too many losers in the process in the short run for the bigger, greater good, which will happen a bit later. But the silver lining of this dreadful, full-scale invasion of Ukraine was that it kind of reignited the process of green transition. It increased the urgency because it showed that actually it's not only for the climate goals, but also it has a very strong component of economic security, of energy security in it. And, as with any political process, it can get stalled because there are other issues being on the agenda which are more pressing given some election cycles in a country. But the recent conflict which has been initiated in the Middle East by the US and Israel had actually showed that, there is even more urgency with green transition because countries which have progressed further on this road, like Spain, for example, they were hurt relatively less from this blockade of oil supplies through the Hormuz Strait, and which is actually what's quite surprising for me because I do not follow Austrian economy per se that closely. But I read that in last year, Austria had the second biggest share of renewable sources in the electricity generation in the EU, about 80%, mostly from hydropower. So, we see many different processes on different levels, but I would argue that this is like a bigger, longer-term trend which is dominating. And of course, there are companies, for most of the companies, the bottom line is profits. Morality is not really factored in the, their operation, how they make decisions. So there will be companies which avoid or rather find loopholes to continue business as usual with Russia. But in the big picture of things, I think there is like a reversible movement towards minimizing economic ties with Russia. Whether that brings the European Union into another type of dependency on China, that's a topic for another conversation. But I think at least there is a very good understanding. They see it now that this is a definite risk, and there is work which tries to create policies to avoid materialization of that risk, in the future. Yeah, I would say that, of course, the EU should go farther. Probably one of the stumbling blocks in this, sanctions development is internal politics, the inefficiency, if you will, of institutional mechanisms of the EU. The decision-making with 27 stakeholders, which needs to be unanimous, this is a very complex thing. That's why we never see a perfect solution. Whether this can be improved in the short run, I have my doubts, to be honest. Also, given the rising strength and popularity of the extreme right parties, and this can become really yet another factor preventing the European Union from making the sanctions more efficient. In a bigger picture of things, there is a very strong movement in the right direction. So I will keep it short because I think, probably we want more questions.
Absolutely, we'll have questions from the audience, but maybe a quick follow-up question about the green transition, because the perception is that actually the green transition is no longer such a big topic in Europe following the 2022 full-scale invasion of Russia on Ukraine. So how can actually the green transition contribute to the energy security debate? Because it seems like we actually saw a return to fossil fuels after 2022, a bit of reversal of the green policies. And this is something also what Europeans are saying in the polls, that climate change is no longer the most important topic for them, that there are other issues on the table. So how can we link back this to?
As I mentioned, the politics, of course, is complicated, and the voters need to be convinced that this is in their interests. This is not going to cause rising prices, but I think given how high impact world oil prices dynamics has on the inflation domestically in the recent months, I think this is not a very difficult argument to win. And it was actually not the case that the green transition was reversed. It was the opposite, and there has been an increase in the share of renewable energy in most of the countries. There is a very big heterogeneity inside the EU. Some countries, like Scandinavia, for example, they are much more advanced in this respect. But I think these pure economic arguments, if not economic security arguments, they are very convincing, and you want to both reduce dependency and also not to be subject to so rapidly changing prices, which can create real shocks for your economy. That's something which any economy wants to avoid. So I wouldn't really say that there was any stop or reversal. It's maybe could be done faster, but it's progressing, and it has been a quite significant increase in the renewable energy share in total energy.
Okay, thank you for making that clear. Okay, so with that in mind, because we are running out of time, and I want to make sure we do have time for questions from the audience, so I'll give you the floor. So just raise your hands. You can introduce yourself briefly and ask any of the speakers about anything that you have heard. Yes.
I was just curious about the first speaker. There are these new sanctions from 25, where you said that the origin of crude oil going over China, India, Turkey, for example, has been now, as a rule, to be depicted or shown or confirmed. Is this technically even possible, or can this not also be tricked by the in-between bargains?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think these documents, they can be forged, but apparently it's not easy. It certainly creates some obstacles for them, because we see in the data that the amount of oil that was transiting decreased right after this law. So I'm not like a narrow oil expert. I don't know how this paper look like and how it is possible to forge them or not. But evidently it's kind of working. There's still some amounts, but maybe you know how.
I mean, I can say a little bit, even though I'm not a chemist, but from what I know from the industry is that every sort of blend or every sort of oil, it has its own chemical characteristics. Yeah. The composition of how many aces and components of molecules, and you can count them. The oil that you get from Saudi Arabia is different in terms of its chemical quality compared to the oil that you get from the Western Siberia. I think the oil from Western Siberia is heavier, it contains more of sulfides, I'm not sure. But the point is, you can run a chemical analysis. Of course, you can't do it on every single barrel, but you can make a randomized sampling from that. So to bypass that, what you usually do, you need a hub. That's why Turkey, for instance, right? You blend different sorts. And you do this also, I think, with gases altogether to mix such that you don't get the same concentration levels of certain chemicals as in like vanilla blend that you would expect from Urals or EPSO. And that's how you, well, like this kind of sword and shield of the sanctions, right? Like you try to find the ways to control that, and then you find the ways also to bypass that by involving chemistry and industrial processes.
And I also think that the oil trade happens through oil traders, right? The big companies, international companies, and those who work with officially on the white market with the EU countries, they have a high standards, high reputation. So these like big oil traders, they cannot allow themselves to, forge the papers, and I imagine that works.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. More questions do we have? Yes, please.
Maybe to Olga. I was thinking, like, since with the recent loss of Orban in Hungary, are we to expect the acceleration of sanctions and more sanctions already?
Well, no, that was very welcome news. And first and foremost, for unblocking the financial aid for Ukraine, because that was critical. If it were not unblocked in a month or two, Ukraine would have struggled enormously, and that would have, put the whole military, the defense operations of Ukraine at risk. But I don't think it will change things too dramatically. It will make things much easier for Brussels, because they do not now won't need to, invent all sorts of weird tricks, like ask Orban to go and drink coffee and take a decision without him. That was just really something of the most preposterous things I read about how they make decisions in Brussels. But I don't think it will change things fundamentally, because there are still, in Belgium or in France, there are companies with very strong interests in different sectors, like diamonds or whatnot. So it will be still kind of a struggle to reconcile interests of all the 27 countries. But it's, it's better than it would have been with Orban still in the power.
You said 2 questions or just one? It's just one question. Okay, and I guess it's still a little bit complicated, given that there are some governments like in the Czech Republic or Slovakia that may still actually
let's see what the German elections will bring.
Let's see what other elections will bring. But only today, actually, I read the news that the 21st package of sanctions is already being discussed and expected among member states. Okay, but we have more questions? Yes, please.
I have several questions, mostly for guests on the right. First, about the EU 18 sanctions package. Do we already have numbers that is working? And if not, can we really expect it to work? Because demand for oil doesn't go anywhere. So even if we label the oil as coming from Russia, India can just say they refine oil from other countries to Europe, and the other oil can just go somewhere else because demand is not going anywhere. So that was the first question.
Mm-hmm. I think it's not much oil now to be shifted around owing to the Hormuz Strait blockade. I mean, it's a temporary thing, but it's a silver lining of the situation. But your point is totally valid. But I think, if I remember correctly, this whole sanctions on Russian oil, they were conceptualized in a way that the third countries in the global south, so to say, that they will not have to deal with the shortages of oil, because no one wants to disrupt the global economy. And the economy is still highly globalized. So, everyone is dependent on everyone else, and these disruptions, they would kind of spread around the globe. And the main idea was to let Russia trade, but control the revenues from it, so that the revenues are really as low as possible. But I think it's not working that perfectly, because all these price caps that have been really avoided quite well by many importers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add briefly that I agree with Olga that the sanctions were designed from the beginning to avoid a sharp increase in oil prices, because nobody wants that, and so nobody wants the Russian oil to go away from the market, because it will the market will explode, and then everyone will be in big trouble. And the second point is that even if we find a way to totally exclude Russian oil and any Russian oil-based products from EU market, it will be better in terms of the current situation and consistency of EU sanctions policy, but it will not change a big thing for Russia and Russian capacity to finance the war, because as I showed you on my slides, the biggest buyers are now India and China and all the other global South countries. So Russia is trying to make a big alliance of non-Western countries that are ready to participate in avoidance of sanction policy. So as long as India and China, the most biggest players, are ready to buy Russian oil, any additional sanctions that work strictly for the EU countries, they will not really change the situation, the big situation, big picture. And there is a way to change it by pushing very hard on those countries. That's what at some point the US tried to do last year, and they sanctioned one, I think, or two oil refineries in India for purchasing Russian oil and reselling it then. But as I also mentioned, the US sanction policy is not so consistent. They can change their minds. They use it as a negotiation tool, and so on. And so they don't. For now, it doesn't seem like they will go till the end in sanctioning Russia, because they discussed at some point, there was this idea in the US administration of creating like a global custom, because Trump, he loves tariffs, like a tariff on Russian oil. It means like everyone in the world who buys Russian oil will have to pay a tariff to the US, the US government. And it was, well, there's some question like, how do you enforce this mechanism, and are you really, do you want Putin to lose this money so much that you're willing to risk your relationship with other countries, with China, with India, and of course for the US, China is much more important than Russia, and Trump doesn't care, unfortunately, too much about Ukraine as we see it. So.
But at the moment, I understand you're saying that the Trump policy is complicated, it's changing all the time, but does it do more harm or more good currently? If you could evaluate it.
Sanction policy?
Yeah.
I don't remember any, so I think that the only major sanction addition to sanctions that he introduced was the last year that I mentioned in September, I think, that he added 4 top major oil producers to the SDN list. It's an American list that sanctioned companies, and if you go to this list, that means you cannot participate in any operations with the U.S. currency, with dollar, and it completely cuts you off from the international trade, because at some point you will have to deal with transactions in dollars, in U.S. dollars. So this is serious, and this affected, for example, Rosneft. It means that you have to rebuild all your real transactions. You have to, for example, switch from dollars to Indian currency rupee, which is then you get a lot of rupees, and you have billions of dollars of rupees on your accounts, and if you don't buy anything from India, you don't know what to do with this money, and it gets blocked on your. So it creates a lot of complications, and this was a powerful move. I don't know why they didn't do this earlier, for example, and they did it only in 2025. So it shows that there are some things that they still can do that still will harm the Russian economy, but eventually I think that there is no sanction in the world that will immediately lead to Russia losing all the money.
Yeah, cut the revenues.
So there's no such thing.
So we can't really effectively cut the supplies, money supply.
We can make it harder, but we cannot
Completely
Completely
closed
stop
now.
the war, you stop the...
Uh-huh.
I think so.
Do we have more questions? I think we have time for... Yes, there's... You have a second one, and then we have a gentleman in the back. Yes, please.
It was more for you from the Denkfabrik. I had never heard about Novaya before. I'm kind of surprised because I thought, at least I'm quite sure that in terms of the EU sanctions package, for every technology made in Europe that was supposed to enable the energy exports, they are banned. So in terms of oil, they are not banned at all. Like technology enabling it.
So there is a difference between export of technology and when you have the localized technology production already. So the Nomatech is the company which has a localized production, which means they do not export. So you don't have to make the good travel across the border from the European, let's say from Austria. You don't need to bring, let's say, some facility to produce something out there. If you have the production sites there already, and if you have some stockpiles which allow you to maintain the operations for several years, technically, you're still in compliance with the regulations.
So it doesn't apply to subsidiaries or anything?
No, it applies to subsidiaries, but subsidiaries, they cannot import the technology from Austria, but they can still keep the operations going. The difference is, though, that I think they are not allowed, don't quote me on that, I think they're not allowed to be involved directly, let's say, with the sanctioned entities like Gazprom. But you can work through the intermediaries. So the way how it usually works is that, let's say you have a company, Gazprom, and it wants to build a well in the earth. It hires a contractor company, right, which is actually does the drilling, right? And then what Nomatech does, it doesn't work with Gazprom, it works with the drilling company and gives the services. Specifically, they lease the equipment to the companies, and they probably come on site and help to maintain that. And I assume that this is allowed. So what the policy should do, it should effectively prohibit to work not just with the designated entities, but with the whole chain which are related to that. The question is if you can control that, right? You need to have a compliance system. You need to control, you need a supervisory system which works for many, many, many companies, which would allow and investigate their reporting and make sure that they report correctly. For that, you need an apparatus, and even the United States, which has the longest tradition and the biggest bureaucracy in that respect for controlling the SDN sanctions which apply across the chain, they have troubles doing that. So the European Union, if it wants to really go in that direction, it actually needs to, well, to build a muscle for that administrative capacity to control for that things. Or they should actually say, look, the localized production should also be banned. And then the companies have to move out. The only thing is that, again, just telling the company to exit doesn't mean that you reduce the capacity. Let's take an example of Schlumberger. Schlumberger was another of these foreign companies which left the Russian market. But what they did was the management buyout. So the capacity stayed there. They just sold the company to the management which was still running the operations. So yeah, they got some money. They lost also some money because they had to pay a fee on this transaction. They removed the corporate spoil stains from their reputation. The problem is that it didn't affect the capacity to build, at least in the near term, for about 3 to 5 years, pretty much at all, because all of the competences, all of the people, all the equipment, it all stayed there physically. That means, you comply with all of the requirements, but you don't affect the possibility of the Russian companies to drill down.
Maybe it's a naive question, but like, why don't sanctions actually also include like a total ban for EU companies to actually operate in Russia?
You have sectoral sanctions, right?
Well, the original philosophy was that you want to affect specific sectors which are related to being the most budget heavy. There was the sanctions which were a near complete ban back in the days with I think it was Iraq. On the regime of Saddam Hussein. They lasted for about 10 years, and they were heavily criticized because people have been starving because of the lack of supplies of food. And I mean, they were not lifted back then, and they did their fair share of damage to the regime of Saddam Hussein when the United States invaded it in 2003. It was severely weakened, and the whole military campaign lasted for about 40 days, pretty much. But that that was pretty much assessed as an inhumane way of doing that. The other thing was, of course, this. I guess in the back of the hand, there was still some thinking that we don't want the Russian oil to disappear immediately. We want to have it. What the original goal was to reduce the margin of production, like the margin that the Russian budget and the Russian companies are able to extract from selling it on the global markets. And that goal was never achieved, actually. Like the price cap which was introduced, it's far above. It's far above the cost level of production. So it could actually be halved, and it would still be somewhat profitable for the Russian companies that they would have an incentive to sell it on the global markets. And this level of cowardice, in a way, I think that is an interesting thing. Like why not all of the countries of, let's say, G7 follow this policy.
Thank you so much. So we have time for maybe 2 last questions. So we have a gentleman in the back that was the first to raise his hand, please. And then lady here.
First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. My name is Dialogbüro. I work mostly about Russian influence campaigns in the West. And I'm quite curious because you mentioned that no sanctions in the world can stop the regime immediately, at least. And what we see, you also mentioned China before, and Russia has a lot of economic allies. And there is a kind of discourse that I witnessed a couple of times, which is very unpleasant, especially for Ukrainians, when they hear things like, okay, the global south sees things different, so all these regimes, basically dictatorships that are allied with Russia. What kind of experiences do you have in academic circles when you tackle that issue, not only about the energy sector, but also about the economic ties? Because we hear a lot of times China wants peace and something like that, but if you look a little bit deeper, look at their narratives, it seems very unlikely.
So the question about Russia's biggest allies, who do you address this question to? Yeah, and
to all of them.
To all of you, okay.
So the question is,
it's about China, yeah.
I understood it's about Russian influence in academic circles.
No, about this discourse, this narrative that because of history, for them Russian imperialism doesn't matter, doesn't happen, and they have to work with Russia. So basically, this.
But it's similar in Africa, where actually it's a completely different story. Russia is seen as a power that supports anti-colonial movement. So,
I'll take that if you allow me. I'm not part of academic circles that much these days, but I do have some stories related to that. So I guess the perception indeed is that for many countries in the world which are not part of the westernized world, let's put it this way, for them, the Russia-Ukraine war is just yet another conflict. For them, it's somewhat like, imagine that for us there is a distant war happening somewhere, let's say in Africa, right? For them, they don't have this level of connection and affinity and emotional connection attached to that. And that's why for them, they see it through the lens of more of a geopolitical competition. So you could say, yeah, that Russian narrative spread there is working, but I do think that this is also the influence, like the still lasting legacy of colonialism and Western colonialism that has its footprints out there. They say, look, yeah, Western countries have been also, not nice to us in the history. And now they see another country doing that, and they see a very different reactions from the West. So they wonder if this is, why is this different this time, right? Why one country might be treated differently than the other. I think this perception, I'm not sure if this is part of the academic circles per se, but I think this is a common perception among the countries which are not so heavily involved into the, let's say, Western discourse per se. So why exactly this happens? Well, it's a very long talk, but Russia tries to use this narrative to kind of solidify its position on the international scene and appeal to this narrative, specifically to the narrative colonialism, to make it look like as if, you know, Russia is not doing something which is disastrous.
Yeah.
Right? So Russia is playing the narrative, but the countries themselves, they have their own ones, which are important to them. And yeah, they look at through their own lens. Example that I can give you is that, for instance, when the package of Western sanctions in the first round have been rolled out, and they have included, I think, the restrictions on which affected the fertilizer production. And this is very important for the countries like Brazil, because Brazil has a lot of agricultural production, and fertilizer is an important input for them, and Russia is a very big player. Also Belarus, by the way. And when those sanctions have been rolled out, there was no communication on that topic with the Brazilian government. So it was supposed to be for, you know, a comprehensive effort, but nobody came to Brazil and said, hey, look, actually, you know, what do you think about this? There was not even apparently a conversation. They were just put in front of a fact. And Brazilian government was really never a big fan of it, because they felt like, you know, we are being sidelined in this process, which is supposed to be a uniform process, which is supposed to be like, you know, a universal condemnation and universal effort. And that's why, of course, they felt irritated, and they expressed that on some occasions. And then you see, of course, that, you know, when you look at the first UN resolutions, there was almost an anonymous support of those ones which condemned the invasion, the fighting, and all this. But as you go past, if you go by several months after, the amount of countries which abstained from the vote or even supported those resolutions brought by the United States, brought by the European countries, it disappeared. Like it's not like that the countries didn't stop voting per se, but like the share of countries which continued to support that reduced quite a lot.
And I think that's a topic for a completely new debate as well. Okay, time for last question. Oh, you also had a question? No. Over there. So, and the lady behind you, actually. So let's collect for the last round, because we have to finish the event. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a question for Anton regarding the environmental catastrophe that happened just a few months ago in the Black Sea region in Tuapse. I suppose it's hard to assess right now the long-term consequences of this disaster, but also the question that the Russian authorities reacted quite with a delay to this disaster. And do you think, do they have a plan? And is it going, are the levels before this disaster ever going to be the same?
And in the meantime, you can translate. I will take just two more, just to collect, to make it a bit faster. Yes, the lady. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe I'm not really aware of how oil market works, but I wonder if there is no oil that is sold by Russia on the world market. Is it even possible to cover all the demand, especially the demand from you, by buying oil from countries that are producing it besides Russia? I mean, is it even possible to cover all this demand without our oil being sold through India or China? Like, just imagine that there's no Russian oil anymore tomorrow, and it's all in storages in Russia.
And your question is to Arnold?
Yes.
Okay, and the last question?
What mechanism have European Union to India to stop this re-export? Is it possible or not?
Yeah. So anti-synchronization. Yeah.
Just to you as well. My question is it even possible for European politics not to know about this leverage that they have through providing the technology to companies like Novaya?
Okay. We have quite a lot to address, so let's start from Anton.
Ну, если я верно понял вопрос, Рафаэл, спасибо за помощь. Значит, какие вот могут быть долгосрочные последствия, да, и что собирается делать российское правительство, чтобы это изменить, я правильно понимаю?
Did I get your question right, that what will the long-term consequences of this disaster be, and what the Russian government will undertake in order to mitigate or tackle this, the consequences of this disaster?
Ну, очевидно совершенно, что российское правительство будет максимально игнорировать эту катастрофу и, видимо, следующие катастрофы, которые будут происходить. Оно будет делать максимально вид, что их не существует, потому что уже анонсирован как это, пляжный сезон.
It's obvious that the Russian authorities, the Russian government is going to keep ignoring what happened and will ignore other catastrophes of this kind that are most probably going to follow because the beach season has already been announced and opened, so this is what we can count on.
Волонтеры из России, конечно, будут устранять последствия, но эта катастрофа на, возможно, несколько десятилетий растянется, что вряд ли.
Of course, there will be volunteers coming from Russia trying to mitigate the consequences and to clean up the consequences of this disaster, but we will see the consequences of this disaster for the next few decades, most probably.
Спасибо. Антон, хочешь еще что-то добавить?
Would you like to add anything you would like to add?
No.
I would like to give the floor to my colleagues.
Okay, so next questions. Yes, Arnold. The demand issue. Yeah.
To answer quickly. So yeah, I think the oil market is pretty flexible and very global. So if you have some oil coming from Russia, it used to come from Russia to Europe, now it comes from Russia to India, and some other oil that used to come to India now comes to Europe, so you can replace those flows usually. So, and also the global production is changing. For example, as Olga mentioned, the United States is now I think the biggest oil producer in the world. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago it was not the case. So there are some new oil also on the market which gets produced. And so I would say that this is not itself a big problem, replacing the supply. What might be a problem is the dependency on certain hard infrastructure. If that was the cornerstone of Russian oil and gas diplomacy, specifically gas diplomacy. When you build Nord Stream and so on, you try to get big investment to build something, build pipelines that will be fixed to a specific territory, so that it will be harder for the country then to change the supplier. And to a certain degree it worked, because the countries that have a lot of Russian pipelines, they're most dependent on it, and they are exempt from some of the sanctions just because they don't have any other infrastructure. They're dependent on Russian pipelines. And the same went with gas. So you have a lot of gas on the market, but you have Russian pipelines, and Russian pipelines won't be they don't land it for other gas. So you have to maybe replace the Russian gas by LNG, by the liquid gas. For that you need to build terminals near the sea, and it requires investment. So the problem is more infrastructure than the amount of oil and gas itself on the market. And the second question about India and the EU. So from what I know, I'm not an expert here, but from what I know, there are two approaches: the US approach and the EU approach. And the US approach, they have extraterrestrial, how does it go? Like secondary sanctions,
Territorial.
Extraterrestrial. Outside of Earth.
With Mars and Mars.
The man from
That would be a game changer.
I would like that. It's some extraterrestrial sanctions.
Next level.
Next level. That could help actually. There was a question. So they have those sanctions. They can be imposed on other countries that violate the sanctions. So, for example, the US can say if an Indian company or any company in the world buys forbidden oil from Russia, it gets sanctioned. And this type of secondary sanction is the most powerful tool that they have, and they use it, and Artem mentioned that it's really hard to follow because the world is big and even the US cannot see all of the transactions everywhere, but still if they find it, they get the violator gets punished really hard, so it works in a certain scale. But the EU, if I understand correctly, they do not have those type of secondary sanctions. It's not in their policy. And what they do, even the price cap, it's the cap on Russian oil, it works on the level of G7. So only G7 countries have to buy that. So in the EU, I'm not aware of any EU sanctions that would be secondary, that would go beyond the EU countries or G7 countries. And India is obviously not a EU country. So,
So you know about that and can do anything with that, yes?
Yeah, they certainly know about it, but they either don't want to do, I think they either don't have the mechanism or they don't want to worsen their relationship with other partners by trying to, and first of all, they don't have the economic power to do that. The US is much more powerful in that regard than the EU because it can really punish the company. EU, I don't know, maybe it's not as. And also you have to coordinate, the problem of coordination I think also plays here because the US is one country, it can decide anything and then you have to all 27 members to agree upon that. And every country can have different relations with India, for example, and some countries have investment from India and so it's much more complicated. I think they don't do it in the US.
Just one small thing I want to add why the US is much more powerful in terms of financial sanctions. Dollar, that's the dominant currency, and that's how the US has this leverage.
There was this last question about the if there is any possibility that the European Union or like the governance of the European Union is not aware that there are local companies enablers. It's very hard for me to imagine that they don't know about that. I'm not part of Brussels circles, so I cannot tell you. Here, I think it would be nice to have somebody who is a little bit more, partying in Brussels than I do. But considering that companies like Scholler Blackman have been receiving media attention to that they've been pressed by the journalists on this issue, and they've been pressed not on the sideline media, but on the primary media, at least in Austria, their standard. I expect that the audience of these newspapers, it goes to party in Brussels, and that means they should bring this info with themselves. One of the issues that they face, of course, is that are the local teams. So you have 100 people working at this Nomatech enterprise. What do you do with them? They can become, in a way, a hostage if the Russian government decides it to be so. In a way that they could just, for instance, not let them get out. They can enforce some legal charges against the management if they start to pulling out the business by just moving out the whole property, the equipment. It is a possibility. There are no rules in this game if they are deemed to be critical for the critical industry for Russia, because oil and gas is the backbone of the Russian economy and the budget systems and the budget revenue. So there is some delicate game at play, right? And it might touch some people's lives. So you have to make some really unpleasant choices.
The budget still makes profit.
Yeah, the company it's a very profitable business, I have to tell you. The return on, the ratio of profits to revenue is about 25%. That's a lot. That's a lot.
And on this sad note, we're going to finish up. Please join me in applauding our excellent speakers. It was an informative discussion. To our host, Dialogbüro Vienna, and there's still an opportunity to actually talk to our guests, so we'll move to the informal section right now of the debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was really good.
Звука стало в конце.
We went significantly over time.